Thank you for watching the AppLogic online demo. In the next few minutes, I'm going to show you how to take advantage of utility computing, specifically our AppLogic grid operating system, to run your applications for you. What you're looking at the moment is the dashboard to my demo grid, and this basically gives me the status of my system, what services are running, how many applications are running, the amount of resources available in my grid, any messages the system wants me to attend to, and information on the network and how to make my applications visible on the internet. Switching panels to the Applications tab, I can now take a look at what's installed on my grid. And the upper section here is basically templates. These are fully featured applications. All I need to do is drop code in them and they'll run. For instance, I can open up a lamp cluster here, and we'll actually see I have SSL gateway, I have a load balancer, I have a number of web servers, a database, and a NAS appliance, and in fact monitoring as well. And then basically I drop my code on the NAS, and this actually is runnable and scale from a couple of servers all the way up through about 40 servers. So you can actually use this to get your application up and running in just a few minutes. Now for building applications, this is where AppLogic gets very exciting. So I'm going to open up a blank application called Sugar Workspace. And in the next couple of minutes, I'm actually going to define the infrastructure to run a two-tier application. So I'll start by dragging a firewall from our catalog. And this is simply IP tables. It's configured to run on the grid. And it provides a firewall function. And of course, I want to give my user's IP address to go ahead and hit my application at. And so I'd simply give this an IP address. I'll make something up at the moment, 256.10. I'd give it a net mask and a gateway from the dashboard, and this would now be ready to run. Now after my firewall, of course, I want a load balancer, and I'll go ahead and actually drag and drop that onto the canvas. And we'll want to set the resource allocation for this. How much resources should this actually get when it runs? Now the default that comes from the system is 5% of a CPU up through 4 CPUs, from 48 megs of memory up through 256. And the default, where it'll start if I don't tell it otherwise, is 10% of a CPU and 48 megs. Now I can override these if I want. For instance, I can say I want it to start at 25% of a CPU and 64 megs of memory. And this is now where AppLogic will start this appliance unless I override it. So you get very granular control, all the way down to 1% of a CPU and 16 megs of memory in the utilization of your resources. And yet you can still scale any virtual appliance up through 8 CPUs and 16 gigs of memory. Now, of course, this is a two-tier app, so the next thing we want to do is grab a couple of web servers, and we'll go ahead and pull those onto the canvas here. That's important to note. These are all standard software. This just happens to be Apache. It's straight off of their website. There's nothing unique about it to AppLogic whatsoever. And in fact, if you wanted to run a different version of Apache, or in fact a different web server altogether, you're certainly free to do so. And in fact, users have used many other applications. And I need to give this some content. Right now, if I were to boot it up, it's simply going to show the under construction page in the Apache Feather. So to give it content, I need to create a volume. So I'm going to go Manage Volumes. And it's going to show me a list now of the volumes that are part of my application. Now it's important to note that these volumes are specific to this application instance. They're not. This isn't a whole list of volumes on the grid. And if I go ahead and create a new one, I can just give it a new name here. We'll call it temp2. And we'll go ahead and make it fairly small, 10 megabytes. Needs a capital M and a file system. And we'll go ahead and now tell AppLogic to create that volume for us. Now that volume is actually created on the grid in the IP SAN that's created out of the disk drives that make up the nodes on the grid. So literally we've created a SAN within the grid instead of using a separate SAN. And in fact, when we issue this command, what happens is the volume manager that runs on top of that SAN is creating 2 mirrors for us. So now there are 2 copies of our data on different servers. That way, if we ever lose a server or lose a disk drive, we don't actually lose any data. My application can continue to run. Now to assign a volume to my server, I simply come in here and click on User Volumes, and I'll go ahead now and give it, in this case, the code volume. Now the next thing I'm going to do is I want a database. Oops, I have to say done for that. Here we go. I'm going to go ahead and grab a MySQL database, and we'll drag it onto the canvas. And again, we're going to go ahead and give it its volume. In this case, it's the data volume that you saw earlier. And the last thing we need to do now is actually hook all our appliances together. Now note, I don't actually have to think about the IP addresses at this point. These are all virtual connections created by AppLogic for me when my application runs. Now there's a few more steps that I'm going to skip, and I'm going to go ahead and actually exit this and move to a completed application. But in just a few minutes, as you've seen, we've actually created an instance of Scalable Sugar CRM, drawing the same picture that we ordinarily would have drawn on a whiteboard for the last 10 years. So there's no new concepts. We all know what load balancers are, what firewalls are, what web servers are, what databases are. And yet AppLogic now has completely packaged this application. We didn't talk about physical resources at all. We didn't talk about servers or IP addresses or anything else that would bind this application to the data center. And so now I can configure the application as a whole unit. I can look at the resource budget for the application from 1.6 CPUs all the way up through 40 CPUs without any changes to my application whatsoever. I can also look at the properties necessary to actually instantiate a copy of this application. I don't have to go into config files and figure out what the format is or figure out which config file for which application. I don't even need to think about the components that make up my application anymore. And yet I still, if I want to, can log into any appliance at any time and have full root access and see what's running there. I can install software just as if it was a server. I can even change out the kernel if I want to, or compile kernel mods to create custom appliances. And then lastly, we see this little icon here. This is the monitoring appliance, and I can now actually build custom dashboards for my application that will show me the status of my application at a glance. Now I've pre-built one here. This is very simple. What it does is it gathers the CPU utilization, free memory, received bytes, and sent bytes for the main three appliances in my application, those being the web servers and the database. And so if there were any obstacle to my performance in my application, I would expect to see the CPU utilization skyrocketing or the free memory plunging. But since there's nobody hitting this application at the moment, there really isn't much to see. So I'm going to go ahead and close this, and in just a few minutes we've built an application and shown you how to actually control and operate an AppLogic application on the grid.